Really that long? Please don't be that long, bruv. Maybe it isn't. 14 pages. All right, props. We're back with The Madness of Mary Lincoln, Chapter 5 by Jason Emerson. And I will turn on the light as I switch over. Mrs. Lincoln admitted today, Chapter 5. Today, there is much disagreement as to whether or not Mary Lincoln was in fact insane in May 1875, and if she was, from which disease she suffered, and to what degree. Moreover, the term insanity is a troublesome one with various meanings, which also muddles the discussion. Typically, it is used as a lay term for crazy thought or behavior, and this episode in Mary's life has become established as the insanity episode in the Lincoln literature. The term insanity has also come to be used as a legal term, where an insanity defense argues that the accused suffered a mental condition that rendered that person not responsible for his or her actions. In this context, Mary could be dubbed insane because her trial declared her sufficiently irresponsible to be unfit to control her person or her property. Hello, Bobs. 21st century mental health professionals, however, dislike the term insanity, which has largely been replaced by psychosis in modern psychiatric terminology. In fact, the word insanity and insane do not even appear in the index to the most up-to-date official listing of acceptable psychiatric diagnoses. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, IVTR, published by the American Psychiatric Association. Psychosis basically means any condition that causes the affected person to lose contact with reality. The most common of these breaks with reality are delusions, fixed beliefs in something that is untrue, and hallucinations, sensations of sound, sight, etc., of something that is not really there. The evidence shows, like the moon, it's not there. The evidence shows that Mary suffered from both, such as her stories of the wandering Jew, the Indian spirit, and the voices in the walls and floor. Psychoses are not the only serious psychiatric illnesses. However, patients who are severely depressed may not have delusions or hallucinations, but they may be extremely unhappy in a sustained way, lose their ability to enjoy things, lose their energy and motivation, stop doing their usual activities, feel irretrievably helpless and hopeless, and even cease functioning. Mary had both psychotic and severe depressive symptoms at various times in her life, not just in 1875, suggesting she suffered from what came to be known as manic depressive illness, now called bipolar disorder. No, the moon is made of fucking bile. Bile and biomechanics. Since these episodes recurred, she actually suffered numerous insanity episodes, and not simply one episode that resulted in her commitment. What if I told people that the Black Santa in Inkster wasn't really black? He was white. Would they say I had psychosis? In this respect, it would be more medically accurate to describe the events beginning in March 1875 as Mary's institutionalization episode rather than her insanity episode. In spite of the technical classifications of insanity, or perhaps because of them, historians have offered radically different conclusions and interpretations of Mary's actions and mental condition, utilizing the exact same evidence. Right. This has caused one historian to wonder whether evidence matters in matters of historical importance. In the days following Mary's trial, however, no one was terribly surprised at the tribunal or its verdict. The news spread rapidly across the country. Public opinion and newspaper editorials generally supported Robert in his action and at the same time lamented that it had been necessary. They sympathized with Mary Lincoln, found her blameless, and attributed her derangement to the murder of her husband. Nothing but an imperative sense of duty and of filial devotion could have compelled the institution of the inquiry, the Chicago Tribune editorialized. It has been generally known in the circle of the lady's acquaintances and personal friends that something of this kind would eventually be necessary. As will be seen from the evidence, Mrs. Lincoln's mind has been for 10 years prey to growing madness, and this fact, now made public, will cast a new light on many of her past actions, which were harshly criticized by those who did not know her, and which, while understood by her personal friends, could not be explained by them, since to have done so would have been to have exposed her mental condition, which it was then hoped might improve. The Chicago Inter-Ocean, which was a newspaper, called it one of the saddest trials that has ever appeared on the docket of any court in this or any other country. Hyperbole. It stated the witness testimony was conclusive as to her insanity, which began with her husband's assassination and increased after Tad's death in 1871, and it was the sorrowful duty of her son to institute proceedings against her. The Chicago Times called Mary a woman of refinement and education and stated her talk and conversation betoken her a lady and one of no ordinary culture. It is sad to think that she has fallen a victim to the dread malady, insanity. The Times also praised Robert, editorializing that trying as was the position of the only one of her name left to counsel and protect her, he discharged his delicate and unhappy task with filial thoughtfulness. The New York Tribune offered a long paean, or is it paean to Mary, anonymously written by John Hay, President, Abraham Lincoln's former secretary, in its editorial pages. The sympathy of the nation, which has been too grudgingly given to the widow of Abraham Lincoln, will certainly no longer be withheld now that a court of justice has declared her bereft of reason. It has long been known to those nearest to her that her mind never entirely recovered from the shock of the president's assassination, but everything she did or said in that delirium of despair was wickedly and shamefully used against her afterward. There is no doubt that this treatment had its effect in preventing her recovery from the great shock which had shattered her life. The Chicago Times also chastised Americans who sneered, jested, laughed at her waywardness, without doing her the justice to inquire into its cause. The Chicago Tribune, revisiting the case on May 21st, obviously having spoken with attorneys Leonard Swett and Isaac Arnold, clearly sympathized with Mary for breaking under a strain nobody could have endured. It praised her for maintaining her ladylike dignity and character, but stated that her breakdown had long been foreseen by her intimates, that it was postponed as long as affectionate regard could do so with safety to herself. Friends and colleagues of Abraham Lincoln also commented on Mary's trial. Of course, prior to the trial, David Davis, Leonard Swett, and John Todd Stewart unabashedly declared their belief as to Mary's insanity. Davis and Stewart were not present at the trial, but both were pleased by the outcome. I am very glad that it is over, and so far as I am able to judge from the newspapers, everything was done that the melancholy occasion required of you. Stewart wrote to Robert on May 21st. The presence of Mrs. Swett, and she has two R's in her Mrs., or is that Messengers? Sorry, Messengers Sweat. It's not Mrs. I should know that since I just read his name 14 times. The presence of Messengers Swett and Arnold was especially fortunate, and the character of the jury not less so. Davis wrote, "It is a source of deep thankfulness that the matter passed off so well. The terrible strain on you will be removed and you can go to work. Some good comes out of almost everything, and the necessity of confining your mother in an asylum will go very far toward removing the unfavorable impressions created by her conduct since your father's death." Senator Orville Hickman Browning of Illinois said, "As for poor Mrs. Lincoln, I have for several years past considered her demented. John Hay, President Lincoln's private secretary, was characterized in a newspaper as believing there was no question as to Mrs. Lincoln's insanity." Gideon Welles, Lincoln's Navy secretary, told Robert that he believed the widow's hospitalization was long overdue. Mary's cousin, Elizabeth Grimsley Brown, whom Robert consulted in March 1875, had told Robert she believed Mary to be insane, but objected to the idea of putting her in an asylum. However, she believed her failure to prevent the trial was an act of providence. Brown was thankful that perhaps strangers could accomplish that in which relatives might fail. "Neither you, Cousin John, nor myself could have induced your mother to have gone voluntarily before a jury, and our presence, perhaps, would have rendered her violent." In subsequent years, other intimates of the Lincolns offered further opinions. William Herndon believed Mary was, in part, an unbalanced woman. "Her mind is unhinged and has been for years." John G. Nicolay stated that Mary was very eccentric. There is no doubt the shock of the assassination did ultimately disturb Mrs. Lincoln's sanity. Albert S. Edwards, Mary's nephew, stated that his aunt was insane from the time of her husband's death until her own death. Mrs. John Todd Stewart, the wife of Mary's cousin, and Mrs. B.S. Edwards, Mary's sister-in-law, both said they had always believed the anxiety of Lincoln's re-election campaign caused Mary's mental trouble. Adam Badeau, aide-de-camp to General Grant during the Civil War, wrote that the trial finally illuminated circumstances until then publicly unknown. It relieved Mrs. Lincoln herself from the charge of heartlessness or mercenary behavior or indifference to her husband's happiness. It approved the action of the son, which, in some quarters, had been gravely misunderstood, and above all, it showed the suffering Abraham Lincoln must have endured all through those years in which he bore the burden of a struggling nation on his shoulders, whether he knew or only feared the truth. Robert Lincoln, in his disrespect for newspapers and editorialists, expected the outpouring of public judgment, as he wrote to John Hay 2 weeks after the trial. "I knew that on the next day after my action, the whole country would be flooded with criticism, kind or unkind as might happen, but all based on a short press dispatch, which could not sufficiently give the facts. Yet I could not wait any longer when 6 of our most eminent physicians assembled in council, after hearing the statements in writing of most of the witnesses who afterwards testified at the Inquisition, gave me to understand that by longer delay I was rendering myself responsible for a probable tragedy of some kind." He also wrote that it would be impossible for anyone to understand the distress and anxiety of my mind for the 2 months before that time. Just 1 week earlier, Robert had similarly explained his motivations and the necessity of a jury trial to Sally Orne, one of his mother's closest friends. Orne was also the only one of Mary's friends known to have requested from Robert an explanation for the trial. Robert wrote, "If you have since seen any detailed account of the occurrences which forced me to place my mother under care, I think, indeed I know, you could not but have approved my action. 6 physicians in council informed me that by longer delay I was making myself morally responsible for some very probable tragedy which might occur at any moment. Some of my Eastern friends have criticized the public proceedings in court, which seemed to them unnecessary. Against this, there was no help, for we have a statute in this state which imposes a very heavy penalty on anyone depriving an insane person of his liberty without verdict of a jury. My mother is, I think, under as good care and as happily situated as is possible under the circumstances. She is in the private part of the house of Dr. Patterson, and her associates are the members of his family only. With them she walks and drives whenever she likes, and takes her meals with them, or in her own rooms as she chooses, and she tells me she likes them all very much. The expression of surprise at my action, which was telegraphed East, and which you doubtless saw, was the first and last expression of the kind she has uttered, and we are on the best of terms. Indeed, my consolation in this sad affair is in thinking that she herself is happier in every way, in her freedom from care and excitement, than she has been in 10 years. So far as I can see, she does not realize her situation at all. It is, of course, my care that she should have everything for her comfort and pleasure that can be obtained. The responsibility that has been and is now on me is one that I would gladly share if it was possible to do so, but being alone as I am, I can only do my duty as it is given to me to see it, trusting that I am guided for the best. While nearly all secondary works about the trial quote Robert's letter to Sally Orne, in part or full, her reply is nearly always neglected. This is unfortunate because her remarks provide strong evidence against the notion of Robert's heartlessness. It is a great comfort to hear from your own self of the loving care and wise guidance which your dear mother is under. Not that I ever had one doubt of that, for I know too much of your goodness as a son from her own lips to ever allow the first thought or suggestion to have any influence over me. I only wish all the states had the same statute. It is a blessed one. Mary Lincoln's friends and acquaintances, apologists, and critics may have admired Robert for his strength and felicity in the face of such a painful circumstance, but Mary herself did not. She did not believe she was crazy, and in her pain and resentment over the proceedings, she told Robert there was now a breach between them that would never be closed, and that he was no longer her son who would thus treat the mother who bore him and loved him. This statement, in addition to her pre verdict cry of, "Oh, Robert, to think that my son would ever have done this," sounds as though Mary were irreparably angry at Robert. The newspapers, however, reported that she quickly apologized for her outbursts and seemed acquiescent to her fate. Robert himself wrote to John Hay that the Chicago newspaper accounts were factually accurate, except that they implied that Mary was angry. This really lasted for a moment only. She has since been extremely cordial with me. As part of the verdict, Mary was deemed incapable of controlling her property, and the court appointed Robert as the conservator of his mother's estate. Whoa! Drop my little heater. Get back up there, Satan. You okay, buddy? You okay? It's all right, Bubba. You're going off, though. Where was I? As part of the verdict, Mary was deemed incapable of controlling her property, and the court appointed Robert as the conservator of his mother's estate. He now had sole power to collect her income, pay her debts, and spend her money. The day of the trial, Robert filed an inventory of Mary's estate totaling $73,454.18. Mary, however, was indignant at the prospect of relinquishing her property, and at first she refused to surrender her $56,000 in bonds to Robert. She put off the moment at court and lasted until she, Sweat, and Arnold had returned to her hotel room. Finally, she rose up to Sweat, the tears streaming from her eyes, and said, "And you are not satisfied with locking me up in an insane asylum, but now you are going to rob me of all I have on earth. My husband is dead and my children are dead, and these bonds I have saved for my necessities in my old age. Now you are going to rob me of them. Mary yielded her bonds only after Sweat threatened to have the sheriff forcibly remove them from her. Mary was left in her hotel room that night with one woman and two men to guard her, who had instructions to not let her leave. She spent the evening quietly packing and went to bed early. The next morning, Robert visited his mother on his way to work. Later in the afternoon, as Robert and Sweat were preparing for Mary's departure that night for Place, Bellevue Place Sanitarium, Mary escaped. The details of Mary's suicide attempt show it was accomplished with cunning and with more than a degree of intrepidity. It is perfectly frightful to think how near she came to poisoning herself, Leonard Swett exclaimed 4 days later, describing the incident to David Davis. According to Swett and to the contemporary reporting in the Chicago Tribune, Chicago Times, and Chicago Inter-Ocean, all of which agree generally, but vary slightly in certain details. Sometime in the late morning of May 20th, Mary convinced her guards to let her leave her room and descend to the lobby. The female guard was stationed inside Mary's room to prevent the widow from jumping out the window, while the two male guards, one of whom was a Pinkerton agent, were stationed outside in the hallway. All three were specifically instructed not to let Mary leave on any pretense, but also not to physically restrain her in any way. Mary hurried downstairs to the Square and Company drugstore located in the Grand Pacific Hotel and ordered a 2 or possibly 4 ounce concoction of laudanum and camphor, ostensibly to apply to her shoulder for neuralgic pain. The owner, Mr. Square, knew of Mary's trial and mental condition, suspected her real purpose to be suicide, and in order to put her off until Robert Lincoln could be called for, told her it would take half an hour for him to prepare it. Mary said she would return at that time, stepped onto the sidewalk in front of the hotel, hailed a cab, and rode 1 block to the drugstore of Rogers and Smith at the corner of Adams and Clark Streets. Suspecting that Mary would seek the poison someplace else, Square followed her to Rogers and Smith. This guy's a champ. Accompanied by the Pinkerton agent who had followed Mary downstairs. Mary ordered the same concoction from Mr. Smith, but Square quickly entered, pulled Smith aside, explained the situation, and told him not to give her any drugs. Smith made some excuse and refused to give her the mixture. Mary then talked her way past the Pinkerton agent again and directed her cab 2 blocks farther down Clark Street to the pharmacy of William Dale. Square preceded Mary into Dale's store, however, and told the pharmacist not to give her any drugs. Rebuffed again, Mary took her cab back to Square's drugstore in the Grand Pacific Hotel to see if her first order was completed. The druggist at Square's, or is that Squires? Squires, faced with Mrs. Lincoln and still awaiting the arrival of Robert, created a harmless mixture of camphor, burnt sugar, and water. He labeled it laudanum and camphor and gave it to her. Mary had scarcely exited the store before she opened the 3 ounce bottle and drank the entire solution. She then returned to her room to await her expected demise. By this time, the hotel manager had become aware of what was transpiring, and he also sent a messenger for Robert Lincoln. Mary waited in her room for 10 minutes, but feeling no effects of the supposedly lethal drink, returned to Square and Company. She said the mixture was too weak to ease her shoulder pain and asked for more laudanum. She also stepped behind the counter to watch the druggist mix the actual compounds. Thinking quickly, Square said the laudanum was kept in the basement. He descended downstairs, made another mixture of the innocuous burnt sugar and water, labeled it laudanum poison, warned her to be careful, and gave it to her. Once again, Mary downed the liquid as soon as she stepped out of the store, and then returned to her room. Robert arrived shortly thereafter, followed by Leonard Swett, and both stayed with her until it was time to depart for Bellevue Place Sanitarium in Batavia. Finally, finding her efforts at self destruction futile, Mary apparently submitted to her circumstances. For the next few hours until her departure, Mary was cheerful and kind. Sweat reported and apologized for many things she said to me the day before. The Chicago Times reported that Mary's demeanor was so cordial to the friends who accompanied her to the train station that no one suspected the terrible determination of her previous actions. The Inner Ocean dubbed it a fortunate circumstance that Mary's first attempt to obtain poison was at Square's store. For though his activity For through his activity, the nation was spared an additional sorrow, and a life was saved which may yet, in the fullness of her God given reason, appreciate the kindly action of her son and her friends. The fact that Mary Lincoln, an unstable but never violent woman, attempted suicide the morning after a jury declared her insane has shocked people since it was first reported on May 21st, 1875. It certainly adds another layer of complexity to the disagreement over Mary's mental state. John Hay, writing anonymously and apparently without Robert Lincoln's knowledge, in a New York Tribune editorial, bespoke the general contemporary perception that the suicide attempt was a terrible confirmation of the justice of the decree of the court. The question, however, still is asked to this day: did Mary Lincoln attempt suicide because she was insane or because she was a sane woman being committed against her will? Suicide can occur under a number of circumstances. Most commonly, people who commit suicide are not psychotic but depressed. They grow tired of their misery, see no hope for recovery, and decide to end their lives. Likewise, people suffering from chronic pain and illness also may attempt suicide to end their suffering. Some suicides are motivated by psychosis, such as hearing voices that tell them to kill themselves, or developing delusions that someone is coming to torture them, so they avoid the torture by killing themselves. There also is an entire range of parasuicidal behaviors, suicide threats, or attempts that likely will fail but that make a statement or gain attention. Of these circumstances, the possibility of Mary's drinking poison to gain attention is the least likely. There is no evidence to suggest this was her intention, and it certainly was not typical of her character. The notion that Mary's attempt was a reasonably sane response to her unjustifiable situation also is unlikely. A saner reaction would have to simply escape, leave her room, hire a carriage, and leave town. Her guards were told not to forcibly restrain her, and considering the ease with which she visited 3 separate drugstores, an attempt to flee Chicago might well have succeeded. Mary clearly understood Robert's aversion to publicity, and she could easily have caused enough of a public spectacle, or threatened to make Robert reconsider his plans. Of course, tales of the perfectly sane being railroaded into an asylum by impatient spouses and greedy heirs, followed by the struggle of the hero to escape such unjust afflictions, makes for a compelling drama. It happened to Elizabeth Packard, who subsequently changed the law, and doubtless to others. But as an institutional norm, the overwhelming majority of such accusations and stories have been disproved since at least the time of Mary's trial. I don't think that's true, honestly. There were many people, and when I researched the Eloise Asylum, which was the Wayne County Insane Asylum in the Detroit area, where many spouses were placed into psychiatric care without their consent and were kept there for decades, and many were reversed. So I think this guy's wrong on that aspect. But when considering all the evidence, Mary's delusions, hallucinations, mood swings, incapacitating depression, chronic illness, the public humiliation of her trial, the perceived theft of her money and property, the perceived betrayal by her son and her husband's closest friends, her impending loss of personal freedom, her willful ingestion of what she believed were two lethal doses of medicine, and perhaps, as two medical historians have theorized, a post traumatic stress reaction to her husband's assassination. The case in favor of this being a serious attempt to take her life is overwhelmingly convincing. The theory that the suicide was a false story planted in the newspaper is rebutted by the fact that no less than 5 newspapers reported the incident, as did Leonard Swett in a private letter, and every source contains minor differences in detail, indicating no single origin for the story. Likewise, Mary's room windows at the sanitarium were protectively covered to prevent suicide, specifically because of her May 20 suicide attempt. The reason Mary never again attempted suicide can only be surmised, but it may very well have been a measure of her tenacity and strength of character. As Dr. Norbert Hirschhorn stated in his excellent examination of the suicide episode, the afternoon of May 20, however, Robert Lincoln took no chances, and he and Swett stayed with Mary until the 5 p.m. departure for Bellevue Place. Mary, Robert, and Swett went together to the train station. Mary was allowed to take all the baggage she wanted, so she brought 5 trunks with her, and another dozen were to follow later. Besides all the clothing, curtains, and jewelry Mary had hoarded, she also brought a number of carpet bags filled with a considerable number of carpet-covered footstools, a situation Robert considered bizarre, but he said nothing and let her take them. At the train station, Mary was kind and uncomplaining to Swett, the previous day's bitterness apparently gone. She took his arm as they approached the station, and she even urged him to come visit her. Swett then left, and Isaac Arnold, Mary's attorney, and Dr. Richard J. Patterson, superintendent of Bellevue Place Sanitarium, arrived to accompany Mary and Robert to Batavia. The party traveled in an elegant special car proffered as a courtesy to Mary by the directors of the railroad, complete with cooking and sleeping conveniences. At the end of the 90-minute journey, Mary Lincoln beheld her new home. In the span of 10 years, the former First Lady had gone from the White House to a boarding house to living as a homeless wanderer, and now to an insane asylum. Bellevue Place Sanitarium was a well-respected private asylum for a select class of lady patients of quiet, unexceptionable habits. It was established in 1867 as a retreat for the treatment of nervous and mental diseases, using the most modern moral treatment of rest, diet, baths, fresh air, occupation, diversion, change of scene, no more medicine than absolutely necessary, and the least restraint possible. Located on the banks of the Fox River, 35 miles west of Chicago, Bellevue Place welcomed new patients to a rural setting of 20 acres of secluded grounds with manicured lawns, large shady evergreens and elm trees, and numerous flower beds. Bellevue was well known for its unparalleled rose bushes and ornamental shrubs, all interwoven by concrete walkways and driveways, studded with hammocks and lawn chairs. Bellevue's property also boasted 40,000 square feet of greenhouses, also with wide walks and ample seating. There also were carriages and sleighs available for patients to use for daily outings. The main building of Bellevue Place was a massive 3-story limestone structure, complete with ivy creeping up its walls. The interior was bright and spacious, with hallways 100 feet long and 12 feet wide, high ceilings, and large, well-lit rooms. The decor was elegant furniture, potted plants, and vases of fresh flowers. Was designed to give a bright, cheerful, and home-like expression. One of Bellevue Place's brochures advised, because in all of its appointments, Bellevue is intended to create an atmosphere of home with its restfulness, freedom, and seclusion. In keeping with its calming aesthetics, Bellevue Place admitted only the best of patients as well. Typical patients, all of whom were female, were nervous invalids who were not insane, and those who occupy a borderland between undoubted insanity and doubtful sanity, and incurable patients who either could not gain admission to state hospitals or whose family preferred a more private retreat. The majority of patients were depressed. Some were suicidal, but all were quiet, as Dr. Peterson did not admit patients who were habitually noisy, violent, or destructive. Bellevue was equipped for 25 to 30 patients, but there were only 20 inmates in mid 1875. You had 100-foot long halls for 25 patients. As a residence, Bellevue housed both its doctors and its patients, and almost as if it were an ersatz bed and breakfast was run by the Patterson family. Dr. Patterson served as primary physician and superintendent. His wife acted as matron. His son, Dr. Paul Patterson, was his father's medical assistant and partner. His daughter, Miss Blanche, also worked there, probably as assistant to her mother. There also were a dozen attendants and nurses. It is probably only due to the later controversy over Mary's confinement that posterity knows so much about Mary's living conditions and treatment at Bellevue. Succinctly, as stated by historian Rodney Ross, whose father was once superintendent of Bellevue Place, no other patient received such favored consideration. Mary had her own private suite of 2 rooms on the second floor, including a private bath in the part of the house reserved as the Pattersons' private residence. The larger room was Mary's sitting room and bedroom. It was carpeted and plainly furnished with a bureau, rocking chair, lounge, plain bedstead, and elegant bed. The smaller room of Mary's suite was occupied by a personal attendant, a young former schoolteacher selected for the position on account of her kindness and intelligence. Charges were later made that Mary suffered barred windows and locked doors. This was untrue. Every room in the house had windows fitted with a protective covering to prevent falling. Patterson called it a light ornamental screen. Robert Lincoln referred to it as a white wire netting, such as you may see often to keep children from falling out of the window. A journalist who toured the hospital described it as merely an ornamental screen of steel wire with a 6-inch mesh woven in a diamond pattern, not at all suggestive of bars. This covering was removed from Mary's room at Robert's request, but later reinstalled by Patterson after he remembered Mary's attempted suicide the day after her trial. Mary's door was locked only at night, with the key kept by her personal attendant, who slept in the second room of Mary's suite. During the day, Mary kept her room key and could walk or drive anywhere she chose, on or off the grounds, while accompanied by an appropriate attendant, usually her personal attendant, or Miss Patterson. She was allowed to receive visitors and also to visit friends. In the nearby town of Batavia, Mary often visited the Patterson family in their personal rooms on the first floor, sometimes taking her meals with them, the rest of the time eating in her room. Mary's stay at Bellevue Place was documented formally by sanitarium staff in what has become known as the Patient Progress Reports for Bellevue Place, a commercially bound volume 9 by 12 and a half inches in size, with entries written in ink by 2 separate people. These reports are invaluable to the study of the case and reveal much about Mary's condition. Mrs. Lincoln admitted today, reads the first entry, May 20th, 1875. Case is one of mental impairment, which probably dates back to the murder of President Lincoln. More pronounced since the death of her son, but especially aggravated during the last 2 months. The daily entries from then until the end of June show Mary gave her attendants little trouble, slept well, was always pleasant, but usually depressed. Evidence of her depression can be found in her activity, which is a typical result. During her first 10 days in the sanitarium, Mary took a walk or carriage ride nearly every day. By the beginning of June, however, she became more inactive, refusing to go out more often than not. In a period of 33 days from May 29th to June 30th, she declined to go for a carriage ride and usually to even leave the building 22 times, or approximately 70% of the time. Mary also had trouble completing activities she said she would do. On June 10th, she tried to pack a trunk of her possessions to send back to Robert, but failed to complete it. On July 2nd, the report noted Mary would habitually make an appointment for a morning carriage ride, postpone it until night, then refuse to go and repeat the same performance the next day. This behavior also is typical of depressed people who are urged to be active. Robert Lincoln visited his mother every week, often bringing his 5-year-old daughter Mamie with him. For the first month, he found his mother quite friendly to him. While she will not in words admit that she is not sane, still her entire acquiescence in absolutely everything, while it arises in part from the plain, enfeebled condition of her mind, makes me think that she is aware of the necessity of what has been done, he wrote to John Hay in early June. On June 17, Robert's visit was marked with a reception not quite so cordial in her manner as at previous visits. Privately, Robert Lincoln received numerous letters from the general public offering both sympathy and criticism over his mother's insanity trial. He noticed in all of them, however, the impression that his mother was in close confinement, the writers using the word asylum with the notion of straitjackets, cells, and brutal keepers. He and Leonard Swett both felt it necessary to correct this misunderstanding in the public perception. Robert wrote to John Hay, his good friend and an editor at the New York Tribune, to ask him to write a short article containing a statement of the actual situation in the form of a letter from the newspaper's Chicago correspondent. Robert's reasoning for his request shows his lifelong distrust of journalists. We think it better to be started in your paper for several reasons. One is on account of the broad field you cover. A negative reason is the sensational character of our local papers. But he wryly commented, "It will be a triumph of journalism, for there isn't a lie in it, but you must not tell the personal column man so, or he wouldn't touch it with a pair of tongs." Children of Robert T. and Mary Harlan Lincoln, clockwise from top, Abraham the Second, Mary, Mamie, and Jesse. Courtesy Friends of Hildene, Inc. Robert's request of his friend Hay has never been recorded in the insanity case historiography, nor has Hay's response. His anonymous editorial explained that Robert's action was taken only after consultation with family, friends, and 6 medical experts. It described Mary's situation as related above: private rooms, friendly attendants, and personal freedom. Such has been the influence of the quiet and pleasant surroundings that nothing whatever has occurred to render necessary anything more than a prudent supervision, and this is given by pleasant companionship without any appearance of restraint. At present, her derangement exhibits itself mainly in a general feebleness and incapacity, and is not yet possible to give an opinion as to her restoration. Hello, Brobs. I don't know who's here still, but by early July, Mary was growing restless. She started walking multiple times in the night, and on July 5th had a fit of crying. Then on July 8th, a reporter for the Chicago Post and Mail arrived at Bellevue, hoping to update the paper's readers on Mary's condition, her treatment, and how she passed her time at the sanitarium. The journalist, a Mrs. Rain, was impressed by Dr. Patterson, whom she found friendly and gracious, and also by the beauty and warmth of Bellevue itself, which she thought could easily be imagined as a cozy hotel. She did not expect to see the former First Lady, since in her 7 weeks at Bellevue, Mary had absolutely refused to see any visitors, and even kept to her room when visitors were in the house or on the grounds. To the surprise of both Mrs. Rain and Dr. Patterson, Mary agreed to see her. The Post and Mail article published July 13th, 1875, is an amazing piece of historical evidence regarding Mary Lincoln's time at Bellevue Place. Not only does it corroborate the physical attributes of the inside and outside of the sanitarium and some of the patient progress report entries, it offers descriptions of things otherwise unknown, such as the appearance and contents of Mary's room, and general descriptions of the other 20 patients. But what is most impressive is that Rain reported aspects of Mary's behavior and physical appearance, as well as Dr. Patterson's impressions of Mary's possibility for recovery, not recorded in the patient progress reports or any place else. Of Mary, she wrote, she was dressed in ordinary black, have worn, or is that supposed to be half worn, with white ruches edged with black in the neck and sleeves. Her dark hair, fast turning gray, was carelessly coiffed in a knot at the back with coronet braid. She looked worn and ill, and her hands, ringless and uncared for, were never at rest. I could plainly see in her lustreless eyes and in the forced composure of her manner evidences of a shattered mind. She was perfectly ladylike in manner, but rambling and diffuse in her conversation. She alluded rationally, however, to the past, spoke tenderly of Mr. Lincoln, once as my husband and again as the president. Rain reported that, in general, Mary's dress was at all times plain, even to shabbiness, and no one could be more indifferent to effects of the toilet. This is a relevant observation, since 19th century doctors considered neglectful or slovenly dress by a person ordinarily well groomed an indication of insanity. And yet, shortly after her arrival at Bellevue, despite having 10 trunks of personal possessions, Mary ordered a morning dress of black French cambric, quite elaborately made with white basque and pockets, and a black and white striped lawn, or is that a lawn? I don't know how to say that word, Laun. She never wore these clothes, however, or evinced any disposition to even try them on, but immediately after they were completed, asked for samples of black alpaca, sick from which to select a suit. Her mind was diverted from this, as it was only a form of her malady to accumulate material. Rain found herself overcome with sympathy for the poor, traumatized widow, and could detect the Sukan. I don't know how to say that either. Where is it? Soup can. Detect the Sukong of her previous society manner. What really touched her, however, was the pathetic nature in which Mary would sit alone in her room and imagine herself in company with her husband, senators, and ambassadors, and the way she would sit at her table and hold conversations with her dear dead boys, Willie and Tad. It seems Mrs. Rain did not witness these scenes, but was probably told them by one of the Bellevue Place staff, for they were accompanied in print by the explanation that they were the result of scenes photographed on the brain that only death could erase, and were not a development of Mary's belief in spiritualism. The journalist found Dr. Patterson reluctant to discuss Mary's condition, but he conceded she was quiet, rested well, and was quite satisfied with her surroundings. He did say, or at least intimate, that he had little hope for Mary's permanent recovery. Interestingly, out of everything that Mrs. Rain heard and experienced during her visit to Mary Lincoln at Bellevue Place, it was the most nominal of things that changed the course of Mary's situation. Apparently, the reporter was acquainted with some of Mary's Chicago friends, and it seems that interest in the widow may have been the instigation for the visit. Mary and Mrs. Rain discussed these friends before anything else, much to Mary's pleasure. At one point in the conversation, Mary alluded very feelingly to her attachment to Judge Bradwell's family. Had Dr. Patterson known the brouhaha that was about to erupt, signaled by those 10 words, he never would have allowed the reporter inside Bellevue Place. And that's all, bros, for chapter 4. Chapter 6, it does not appear that God is good, as awaits us for next time, but that was 52 minutes and 30 seconds of blah, blah, blah. Goodbye, bros. Goodbye.